You're very welcome along. So Heineken Champions Cup quarter-final week is here. Good Friday evening, Leinster against Leicester at the Aviva Stadium. 8 o'clock kickoff. They're hoping to sell about 28,000 tickets. The top tiers closed for this game, unless there's an extraordinary level of demand, in which case they'll open them. But 27,000 would be a good innings for Leinster against Leicester. Saturday, the Sharks, who I think caught the imagination of lots of people at the weekend against Munster, they play Toulouse away in France. That's 3 o'clock game. Exeter have the Stormers 5:30. And then on Sunday, Rajwatch, La Rochelle against Saracens, 3 o'clock. Keith Wood, we have not spoken in a very long time. Hello.
Hello, how are you? A couple of weeks, I'd say, Joe.
A couple of weeks, yeah. It's a long time. Meanwhile, here in the studio, like a bad smell, Rory O'Connor of the Irish Independent. Here you are again.
Evening. Hey, Joe. Hey, Keith.
So, Keith, Sharks 50, Munster 35. You had said last week, talking to the lads in AM, you wanted, certainly at the very least, to see a Munster performance. Difficult place to go, difficult to get a win, but let's see a Munster performance. Were you happy with what you saw from Munster?
Obviously not. I think when you look at the way the game panned out, Munster didn't meet the challenge. And the first thing you do when you play South Africa, or every South African team, is you have to front up. That's the only way it actually works with them. I mean, I saw certain things that had changed that I'd be relatively happy with, but they came unstuck. As more pressure came on, they just became unstuck after one thing after the other. So everything started dismantling. The scrum started being forced back, didn't resource any of the rucks anywhere near enough. And they were targeted, very, very well targeted by the Sharks. Every time there was a ruck, didn't matter whose ball it was. And at the Mall, the pack looked vulnerable. So I felt that it was different from times past, and it looks truly horrible, but it's just very disappointing to watch, and not see that actually happen. And there are reasons maybe and excuses for different things, but what ultimately really only matters is what turns up on the field, and what turned up on the field wasn't good enough.
Rory, do you agree Munster don't even have the consolation of firing some shots and a performance at least to say there was enough in there to feel okay about?
I think that even if you look at the first half in isolation, there was, like, they were in the game. They did fire some shots. It's that third quarter, and at the pivot, the moving quarter, or whatever championship quarter, whatever you want to call it, when the game was in the balance. I mean, you have to be able to cope with everything this tournament throws at you now, and that includes now flying to South Africa and playing in massive heat in difficult and unusual conditions with a load of kids swimming into a swimming pool behind the goal, and all the madness that's entailed of going to a completely new world. And it looked like the Sharks put the heating on in the dressing room. It looked like they came out of a sauna at half time. I've never seen players so beaten coming out of a dressing room, and their body language coming up. Craig Casey did that thing that scrum halves often do, where he sprinted to the dressing room at half time, and they all looked at him as if, don't do this to me, because I can't, I've nothing left. And when they came out, they folded like, I don't know, they were beaten in every department, and they kind of hung in there for the first half, but they couldn't hang in there anymore. It was very, very strange and unusual, and if you back it on top of the Glasgow defeat, which was a pretty horrific performance, but there is a history in Munster of having a bad Pro 12 or Magners League game the week before a big European game, and you can't really get away with it anymore, but you kind of thought there'd be a response because they get what this competition's about, and the Sharks are new to this competition. I kind of thought that their history and all the stuff that we talk about with Munster, and the reason we expect so much of them, would come into a performance, but they didn't look like they had it anymore in that second half. They didn't look like they believed. Their tight five issues were exposed, the John Ryan thing, the fact that so much of their good form was a correlation of John Ryan coming back, and then they let him go again. All of these things fed into a pretty dreadful quarter, probably the worst quarter they've had in European rugby since the Racing 92 semi-final over in Bordeaux, the first quarter when they got blown away. It was a reminder of how far they have to go still, even though they since that South Africa game they've been on a pretty good trajectory. they're now almost back in that hole that they were in the start of the season, having made some progress, but they've taken a couple of steps back and they've kind of got reverted to their own mean, and that's worrying going into a pretty big, Leinster's obviously the focus this week because they have a quarter final to come, but like Munster's European future is on the line next week and the week after in South Africa again against the two South African teams. So there's more question marks. It's a conversation the three of us have had over the years. I mean, at this time of year, every year really, when Munster go out in the quarter final or the last 16 as it is now. But that Sharks team, like, they didn't even look like they knew that it was a Champions Cup game. They just they relied on on all of their kind of their physical attributes and they kind of got the job done. But they scored 50 points in Munster and they didn't even look as good as they could on paper. It was a very strange, it was a very unusual game. I don't know, was it because I watched it off tube and the atmosphere didn't really come across, but it was a really weird game that didn't really fit what we expect from a European knockout game. I don't know if Keith would agree, but I thought it was a very strange occasion and everything as well.
Yeah, I disagree with a bit of that, Rory. It's funny, when we were talking on AM last week, hadn't fully seen the Sharks side, didn't quite know exactly who they were going to bring into it. Ultimately, they brought back in 6 or 7 players who've won a World Cup in 2019 who looked as fresh as daisies. And whereas they may not fully get what the European Cup is, they're serious competitors. They're also very, very large men, and there's no stepping away from that fact. And they know exactly how to use it. So I feel that I thought they played very well, if not fully aligned with each other, but their quality when they turned up the heat, excuse the pun, their quality was extraordinary. So look, if I talk ruck time first, and so I'm critical of Munster, but I'm also pretty impressed by the level of analysis and form that some of the Sharks players did, performed in, the manner in how they performed. If there was any bit of a gap in a Munster player going to hit a ruck, there was a flood of 3 South Africans into it. So one of our guys, we're not as big as they are, but 2 of our guys against 3 of their guys, unless we're in a perfect position, you're holding, you're pushing against the waves, ruck after ruck after ruck. I just looked at Casey, and then Murray had players just falling in on top of them. Scrum time, falling in on top of them, So the intent, they'd exposed where Munster were a little bit weak. And when I'm looking at Munster at the moment, I'm looking at where they're trying to make a change. They're trying to be more progressive in the backs. They are, they're looking to play wider. They're looking for an offloading game. I think they've shown those signs during the year. I still thought they showed those signs on Saturday. However, under the pressure that they were under, they were trying to follow through those moves. Look, the phrase was "don't shovel shit." That was the phrase we were given our whole life. If you're under that much pressure, you've called a call, you don't go through with the call, you don't throw that 50-50. They're the 50-50s that cause trouble. So in that third quarter, Munster came out from the second half to the second half. They looked flat, and they seemed to meet this maelstrom of pressure and try to continue playing the play. They're maybe 6 months into doing that, having not done that for 6 years. So it crumbled. It crumbled under it. Those were tries. There was 2 or 3 tries at that instance that weren't a failing of defence. It was a bouncing ball from someone who was smashed in a tackle, or someone trying to pass to somebody else and it wasn't on. That's what it was. And that looked like a team that had tried to make a lot of changes, had expected certain things to happen, that they might meet the battle up front. They didn't. And then they started crumbling in that period of time. So they did come back in the last 20 minutes, and that could be faint praise and scant consolation. But they do show that they're able to fire those shots. To be honest, I think they made the level that they're at. And when you look at that Munster team, you would say there was one starter on the Irish Grand Slam team, and you were playing against a team with 6 winners of a World Cup only a few years ago. So I think that was the difference in quality. And so for when I look at the Sharks, and my difference for you is, yes, they looked a bit dysfunctional. They're only coming into being fresh. They're going to be really impressive over the next period of time. It becomes an interesting game for them at the weekend, but they'll get closer and tighter all along. And look, I think they'll be a challenge for any team. I think we've ended up with the best finalist teams in the competition.
Rory, you referenced we've been having this conversation for years at this stage. So Munster heads have been bumping off a fairly consistent ceiling in Europe for years now, and the exits always feel very dispiriting because they were playing a brand of rugby which is reductive, and it was never likely to work against the bigger and better sides either, so there was a grim inevitability to their exits. Keith's touched on new coaching ticket, new approach. Here we are at the same ceiling. Is this exit every bit as dispiriting as the previous 4, 5, 6? There you go. That was but a taste of the full rugby conversation. As usual, you can get the full chat wherever you get your podcast. It's waiting for you right now.